Hey everyone, good morning and welcome again to another episode of the Layoff Legends podcast, where we come together to listen to layoff stories with a focus on finding inspiration, encouragement, and guidance, the layoff tech community, and hopefully even beyond. I'm your host, Leo, a Microsoft L66 PM that was laid off last October. I am so delighted to host another episode today with another special guest who I had the privilege of meeting through another podcast guest, Regine Smith, which you all heard from I think a couple of episodes ago. Courtney, welcome to the Layoff Legends podcast.
Thank you, Leo. Appreciate it. Really look forward to talking to you.
I'm so delighted to have you. I think in our earlier call when we talked and just got it caught up, you had such an amazing story. And so all of those tidbits, I'm expecting those, and I'm sure our audience is going to enjoy those as well. And so this is incredible. I think we have started these stories, and we're hearing and learning so much from people that have been through these, from some of the largest tech companies in the world, but everybody's experience is different. And it's been really interesting, both the company culture aspect, but then also the personal and the human experience. And so before we even jump in, would love to learn a little bit more about you, get to know who you are and what your journey has been so far.
Yeah, so I kind of divide my career into sort of two halves, right? So the first half, so about the first 10 years of my career, I was in marketing communications, but I was more on the advertising PR side. And then this thing called websites came up and was invented. And I'm being sarcastic and joking there because that kind of dates me a little bit. And my boss at the time comes to me and says, "Hey, I want you to maintain our websites." And I, of course, did not go to school for that. And this were in the very early days of when company websites were becoming a thing. So taught myself HTML and was a web editor, or what you might call a front-end developer today. And then I was laid off, and I kind of had a career shift where I worked retail to kind of make ends meet for a bit. And then I transferred actually up into the Seattle, Washington area, which is where I am currently. And I entered into more of a project or program management kind of work, which I had not been doing in my first part of my career. So for the last 10 years, that's primarily where I've been. So across different industries, so retail, finance, tech, and now life and health sciences, nonprofit. And I've typically been still in the marketing or on the business side of project and program management, so not necessarily a technical IT PM, but I'd like to consider myself sort of a hybrid in the sense that I can be a really good partner within the business side, but also be able to talk the technical terminology or aspects when we have to partner, let's say, with a development team or an IT team for some sort of execution of a project. So that's been the last decade. So the first decade was very much more along the lines of what you think about marketing, so advertising and PR and things like that. And then the second half of my career really shifted me more towards project and program management, and that's kind of where I sit today.
Well, you speak multiple languages when we think about, the tech industry and how you can connect over disciplines. And so that's a tremendous experience.
Yeah, I find too, when you are interviewing for jobs, sometimes the roles are specific. So especially in PM world, and your viewers and your listeners probably know this if they come out of that background, there is specifically technical PMs. And oftentimes those PMs have lived in that space for most of their career. For me, I've been finding this niche need sometimes with employers where they need someone who can understand that, but they don't. That's not what they're hiring for, and they're kind of looking for that person that can speak to all sides of the business or all different aspects of the business, and then be able to sort of translate that into various, project plans and things like that. So I didn't really realize that it was going to be a valuable skill, or that I was, just by the nature of the roles that I had taken on and kind of how I ended up in some of these companies working with the different groups, that I would build this background. But it's served me really well. And I actually appreciate all the way back in that first half of my career where my boss at the time kind of challenged me to do something I never thought I would do, but it built a foundation for me to understand how you build a website, how you host a website. And again, this was self-serve. We were doing it on our own, but I had to learn terminology. I had to learn development cycles. I had to learn things that I would not have normally thought would be something I would do in that sort of advertising PR manager role, but was able to lean into when I essentially went down this PM path to be this sort of hybrid-like project program manager and partner really well with both the technical side and the business side. So yeah, my experience has been very varied, but it has ended up being kind of a happy accident, I guess, because I don't know that I planned it that way. It's just by way of opportunity and kind of how your roles evolve in the company that you're with. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful for it, actually.
It's incredible. I mean, the variety of experience actually accrues over time, like a little bit of compounding. And when it comes to collaboration with other disciplines, it just makes it so much easier when you're speaking the same language. Those skills that you developed, were those in smaller companies, right? So you just kept on, right? And of course, the complexity was so high then. We don't have a lot of these, you know, very simple tools that we could use. Point and click, drag and drop. Were these smaller companies? Were these larger companies that you were picking these skills off from as you kind of built your career portfolio, so to speak?
They were not, well, no, I would say, actually, this is a good question because I don't know. I think today we define small company as what, less than 500 employees or 2 to 500 employees? Like, what is the threshold that we define small company at? I would say in the first part of my career, I did something that people don't typically do now. So I stayed there for 10 years, right? So present day, a lot of folks really move, especially when they're starting out. They will stay someplace maybe 2 to 3 years or in a role, and then they might be promoted or move up, or they might stay with the company, but their role shifts and changes. And mine did do that, but I also stayed with that same company, so I didn't bounce around. And at the time, we were probably it was in the real estate industry. It was corporate-owned real estate in Southern California. And we were probably about 1,000 employees total for us, but we were also owned by a larger conglomerate that had more employees than 1,000. And then when I moved up here for a retailer, we were still in that range, I would say, 12, 1,500. If we counted our store employees, that would be a lot larger. And that was true when I moved into finance. It wasn't until I got into tech where we were talking about the 70,000, 80,000 number of employees. So I would say, I don't know, would that be smaller to mid-size if we're talking 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 versus 80,000? I would say tech was the introduction to really large company, but I'm currently at a nonprofit where there's about 6,000 people. So even that's bigger than what was, the first maybe 3 or 4 companies in my career. So it's a nice mixture, but I would definitely say tech opened the sort of, you really are a very small percentage of the overall employee population. And that was the largest company I had ever worked for. So, I think it would depend on how we define small company this day, or how folks out there want to think about small versus medium versus large. Certainly tech, we put in the large to extra large category.
Yeah. And I think that even the evolution too, right? So at some point, tech was just the IT department.
That's right.
Somewhere in the basement, and I think over time it's evolved to this strategic component of the company, competitive. Now you can't move forward without a very strong team, the CTO, the CIO, like all of that, and how that trickles down. And whether you're at a large company or a nonprofit, building your newsletter, connecting with your donors, all of that is tech.
Yeah.
And so it's really, really interesting. The languages
that
you've learned over time to be able to speak that where you are right now?
Multilingual, as we like to say,
Yeah, no, that's
from the business,
fantastic.
from a techie, businessy kind of side of things. Um, and the more projects that I work on, or let's say the more teams that I interact with, I can start to see kind of how my experience fits into a very unique bucket, but also that allows me to communicate, to understand, I think, how to communicate across groups. For example, I had a meeting this past week with a member of our team, and she's on the more technical side. And I said, "Oh, are you working in sprints?" And she's like, "Yeah, I am." I'm like, "Are you 2-3 week sprints? Are you a month? How are you working that?" I don't know that all PMs would think to ask that, or PMs coming out of the business side would think to ask that. If you haven't had exposure to working, let's say, in an agile way, it might not be something that's on top of mind. But I think my experience on the whole, and being able to touch a lot of departments or work with a lot of different people, has also widened my ability to be a strong communicator around the work that we're doing, and also by way of reaching out and bringing people into the work. We should talk to so-and-so. I think it would be really good if we had somebody representing XYZ at the table. It's given me that broad lens, and I would not trade that. So it seems like it has come by way of, like you say, evolution of just opportunity and how I've landed in certain places. But it's built a really strong toolkit for me, and I use it all the time. So we have definitely moved beyond just sort of one or two departments that you need to collaborate with. You could now be up to 5 or 7 or 10 or something to that effect. And it is really advantageous, especially as a PM, when you're kind of that air traffic control. So you're somebody that is trying to make sure all the planes are taking off and landing and nobody's, crashing out of the sky. I use this analogy a lot. It helps to have a broad knowledge of roles and groups and teams, and then be able to incorporate them depending on what your purview is.
It makes complete sense. And I think you mentioned this word toolkit, and we'll come back to that and how
Toolkit.
the sense of tools that you've kind of built over time. I'm curious, you mentioned Layoff very early in your career, and you think it was the first company. So have you been through multiple layoffs? Like, what's the story there?
Yes. So 4. So I've been through 4, and each one's been a little bit different. So the first one was highly impacted by, I'll date myself, which is fine. It was in 2008. So it was with the collapse, essentially, of the housing market, right? And I was not in the right industry in which to weather that. So I was, like I said, in real estate. What's interesting about that is I watched our company essentially close offices, consolidate offices, because I was for your context for your viewers and your listeners, we were corporate owned. So there was a corporate main HQ, but we serviced, was about 100 offices between Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego. So we were not affiliate real estate where you sort of, there's an owner individual of a real estate office that you see. We were a corporate owned entity. And I watched throughout that year, we consolidated, we saw people within the corporate HQ be laid off. And it was a strange environment because you started to wonder, I did, for me, I said, could it happen to me? Would they eliminate our roles? Would they eliminate our team? And I say this to people because, or I share this story sometimes when I'm talking about layoff experiences. That is a really hard space to live in, where you are watching people be laid off around you. And then you start to wonder if you're going to be in that group eventually, but you don't know. It's a hard mental exercise because you're constantly in a state of uncertainty, maybe looking over your shoulder. And I've often told people I would not wish that on anybody to kind of live that way or have to feel that way, because it adds a whole layer of stress that isn't there when you're in a, let's say, normal climate. So by the time it did happen, I can't say it was unexpected, but you still don't ever expect it to be you. And then the flip side of that is once it does happen to you, you always think it can happen to you. And so it trained me quite early in my career that no one is generally immune. And you do end up with this weird sort of shadow figure or voice in your head. Once it's happened to you, you don't ever think it can't. And I have had a friend, she's kind of been my wing woman this past year of 2024, where we were both laid off, and she got a job before I did. And she had real stress in the first 30 days because she felt like she was maybe making a mistake, and she was worried about how people were feeling and seeing her. And what was happening, at least from my observation, is she was thinking she was going to be laid off again, right after she got hired. There's this, I want to be sensitive to using the term PTSD because I don't want to, I'm not a medical professional, and I don't have any technical advice to say that, but you do have this sort of, it's a little bit of a trauma that happens to you and you don't forget it. And then it kind of can influence you going forward, especially in the immediate aftermath, that distorts your sense of yourself. It distorts your sense of your ability. It distorts your sense of, no, I am good at what I'm doing. I got hired here. I went through the interview process. They liked what they saw. They made me the offer, but you still are fresh or maybe recently rehired after going through maybe your first layoff, which for her this was. And it stays with you until you kind of work that out by way of the new job and the new successes. And you realize not everybody's gunning for you, or you're not going to be on a list within 45 days, right? So it's important to recognize that if you've never gone through it and it is your first layoff, you do have to treat it a little bit like you got to recover from it, and you have to be kind to yourself in how you see yourself and your skill set, and believe in yourself despite what's happened to you. It's not the know-all, end-all of your career. It doesn't define you. And you will find something else, a new spot, a new place that will help rebuild that within you. And it can be such a hard thing for first-timers to really not take it personally or think that they did something. And again, I think it's also important to differentiate. We're not talking about terminations due to performance. So we are talking about layoff by way of we've decided to eliminate your role, or we've decided to restructure and these groups or these teams are affected. Because performance-related terminations can be different. If you have been written up and you're on a process improvement plan and things like that, that is sometimes in a different category. So we're talking about you're blindsided, you had no idea that your role was being eliminated or that your team would be affected. It's your first time. That can stick with you for a while, and you have to give yourself the space and the grace, is what I like to say, to process it. And it's not a linear process either. So you grieve a little bit, and grief is not linear. And so it's all part of how you empower yourself and build yourself back up after something really unfortunate, sad, maybe scary happens. And that's normal. So some people are going to jump right back in and they'll find a new job and off they go. But for many, that's not the journey. And there is an emotional component that can affect you very deeply, even when you go into your next job. I think it's important to normalize talking about that and normalize that is okay. And that is not something to be ashamed about at all.
Yeah, no, Courtney, you dropped some incredible nuggets there. And it's the entire process that people go through, and everybody goes through things differently, right? You have a traumatic event, you respond differently, right? And some people respond in unsafe ways, unhealthy ways. Some people respond in very healthy ways. And of course, it's a building blocks in the next chapter, but life carries on. I was sharing, an experience. I reached out to friends like, we have these friends where you don't really talk to them for 3, 4 months. It's like, hey, how's it going? And you end up catching up and it's like, oh yeah. And by the way, this happened. I was laid off. And she said, oh, okay. So was I. And it's like, so when was your layoff date? So it's like in October. So oh, mine was in October as well. And then we had this conversation and said, so she asked me, is this your first layoff? And it was such a interesting question. No one has ever asked that. What you receive is, hey, I'm so sorry to hear that. Like, are you okay? And of course, those conversations happen. And so I actually said, that's an interesting question. Why would have you been laid off many times before? She's like, absolutely. I work in gaming. And it is actually a nature of the industry. Once the game has shipped, and she works in the context, the artists kind of design that type of world. And she's like, yeah, once it's done, it's like an actor on a set. The movie's over, you go find it. And so it normalized it in a very different way for me. Now, the waves that are happening, in tech are a little bit different from just a movie, being wrapped up and then, the movie goes to cinema. And even the language that's being used today, from business decision to performance to what we're reading now about non-regrettable attrition, like all of these verbal gymnastics to try and, for lack of a better term, justify, right, how these business decisions are being made. But ultimately, people are caught in the middle. And it's interesting. I would love to, go back to some of the right before, even pre-layoff experience, because a lot of these companies tout the culture and the company culture, but culture is not just what's said; it's more often what's done. And so a lot of this stuff you can actually observe. Things are changing. Hang on, what's going on here? So you talked about real estate and the consolidation. A lot of our listeners are in that bucket. Like, oh, I'm seeing other people being laid off. Am I next? I'm curious, in your 4 layoffs, and my goodness, you have been through quite a few. You really have a zen about this, which is
I don't know
absolutely
that
fantastic.
I wanted that as part of my career cycle, but I have
No,
it.
it's a wealth of experience,
I
and
do.
you've come out and you have this, and you're sharing this, and thank you so much for being so open. Did you see any patterns pre-layoff with each of these companies that you're with, small or big? Like, were there patterns of pre-layoff activity, or you saw consolidation or team dynamics or org changes or leadership announcements, acquisitions that helped? Oh, hang on a second. This is coming. Storms are gathering. It's expected at this point.
Yeah, so we affectionately refer to that as spidey sense, right? Is kind of what's going on. So if I look at all 4 of them, I would say 2 out of the 4 yes, 2 out of the other 2 no. So actually, no, that would be 3 out of the 4, 1 out of the 4 no. So in each of the ones where there's a spidey sense that develops, or again, going back to once it's happened to you, you don't think it can't happen to you. For me, I started to pay more attention to things exactly like what you said. Acquisition announcements, leadership changes, leadership announcements. What is the purview of our team? Does our team have a voice at the table? Are we sort of being ostracized and maybe moved and put into kind of a corner of the organization? Or are we part of, let's say, the big bets the organization is going after? Do we have a line item on a strategic plan that's us, right? All of these things can start to, great, yep, we're on the strategic plan. This is our purview. We're good.
Funded. We have
We're
budget.
funded, right? There's like, when those things start to get more vague. So, for example, maybe you as the employee are starting to ask, so what are we working on this year? What are our target goals? And maybe your manager comes back and says, well, we're still working on that, or we're still waiting on leadership to define that for us, da 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 da. And it doesn't come through, or it remains very, well, we're still going to be working on this. But at the same time, you're hearing changes to teams, right? Or changes to leaders, or maybe people moving under someone else that's new. And they're going to have, a meeting of, tell us what you do, tell us about your team, da 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 da. It's not 100% rule, but those are the things that I have developed over my time to start to wonder whether we can be impacted. The other thing that I never really paid attention to until I got into tech was company performance numbers. And the reason that's true is the others were all private. So tech was the first time where I worked someplace that was a target of Wall Street. And that's my terminology. That's not official anywhere. But they watched. We were paying attention to shareholder price. It was bad when it wasn't good. It was good when it was really good. That was my first exposure to that, having come out of either private or co-op related companies. So that adds a whole different level. And all of your listeners likely are coming from the tech side or are very, very tech, but they know what this feels like. When the talk develops of we are not doing or performing the way that we should, that raises a lot of that. Now, for me, I have the experience of where that raises red flags. And in my most recent experience of laying off, which was with tech, we watched, 8 or 10,000 people be laid off the year before, right? And that was a very unexpected thing in the way that it happened because, again, we were still in a work from anywhere kind of environment. And so it was very impersonal. So you didn't necessarily have the, what I would call the old school way, that, again, my opinion, where you get a meeting put on your calendar and you walk into the meeting and there's HR and your manager and you kind of go, that happened to me on one of my layoffs, right? I said directly, so I think I'm being laid off in this meeting. And I had no idea what the meeting was. I thought it was just a one-on-one with my manager, right? We moved away from that with, virtual work and things like that. But people had experiences where their access was shut off and they didn't know why. And sometimes the manager didn't even know that the person was affected. And so there was a real concern in the way people found out. And sometimes that is still happening in tech, where there is the human component that's kind of been removed from what was old school, which was you get a call by HR, you go into the HR office, they go over the package with you, right? And that's a very different feeling when that happens because it's so unexpected, and you do kind of lean into thinking you're going to be guided through the process. And a lot of folks had to kind of figure that out. I think by the time I was laid off, that process got better. I think they realized that was a really harsh way in which to treat people, right? To your point about culture and how do you treat employees, both when they come in the door, but also when they go out the door. That can vary, though, between company to company. So there's probably listeners and viewers out there that are still experiencing that. I was very fortunate in my layoff in February 2024. I had it the old-fashioned way. Granted, it was virtual. So I had a meeting put on my calendar. I thought it was just a rescheduled one-on-one. My manager came to the meeting and I could tell something was not right because she looked like she had been maybe crying or something was not right. It was a very short meeting and I was told, my position was being eliminated. I want to say that I appreciate that because I didn't have the very impersonal experience from my friends from the year before. But that can also mess with you a little bit too. When again, if it's your first time, that's your first experience, that's a very different vibe than when somebody's going to sit in a meeting, whether it's virtual or in a meeting, to kind of try to put a personal touch to it so you don't feel like you've just been, line crossed off on a spreadsheet and tossed out the door. So I think if we wrap it back around to sort of signs, you do start to pay attention when a lot of work changes happen at once, when a lot of consolidating of teams happens at once, when you don't necessarily feel as if your purview of your team or your work ladders to, let's say, the strategic plan or the goals for the year. And then also company performance. Is the company in the news and not in a good way? Do you have, people asking questions about stuff and wanting to know, why are you not doing something? And we're talking about C-suite being asked this, not you personally. Those are all things that especially if you are working, again, in a publicly traded company, as tech is generally, especially for big tech, those are kind of the signs that you do want to pay attention for. You always want to make sure that or not make sure, but that your role, your team, your work is still seen as part of the goal or the go-afters for the company. And that even if things are consolidated and maybe you move to a different team and you report up to that person, you understand how you contribute into whatever that person's new vision is. And the more vague that is, the less clarity around that, the less that is often told to you, that can make you start to feel uncomfortable. And again, I think this is a differentiating factor. If you've had it happen to you, you start to think that. If you've not had it happen to you, you're like, no, I'll wait. And I know because I've talked to different people. Like I've talked with people who have never been laid off, so they don't think that way. Me personally, having gone through it multiple times, I do.
Now, so again, let me interrupt you. I apologize.
Yeah.
This is great. And let's do a quick tangent here because I think in the grand scheme of things in tech, very few folks actually pick what they're working on. Right. So when you talked about external signs, so you kind of go on this team, hey, go do this thing. I'm a PM, I'm a researcher, I'm a designer, go design this thing. So you can't necessarily pick your team. Again, majority of people, there's some folks who can.
Of course.
So to your point around like observing these trends and patterns, what type of questions should people be asking, right? Since they can't pick the team, right? Like, oh yeah, we just got merged. Now we have 2 design teams. We now have 2 PMs or the product isn't doing that well. We launched, but signups are low. Or are we going to change this thing? Are we going to scrap it? Curious, what should folks be asking? Because sometimes that's the signal. And then depends, you may have the autonomy to actually request to shift, move to a different team. But many times a lot of companies aren't very open with that information to begin with. And so you don't know if your business is performing well or not. But I think that we're getting to a place now where people are plugging in a little bit more. They're asking better questions so that they can self-direct on what parts of the company they feel will have the most learning, the most accrue to their career. But also at the same time, I have the philosophy, you shouldn't run away from something, you should run toward. But as we talk about layoffs, being aware of your environment is really, really important. Curious on your thoughts on that approach.
Yeah, really good question. And I do think that's a shift too with the modern day workforce. Folks are a lot more emboldened to ask questions. And I think that's very smart. You're absolutely right. You don't necessarily get to pick what you do in the sense of you applied for the role and then you got hired on your team. And then you are generally given directives, right? You're given a sense of the work that we're doing ladders up to XYZ goal, which ladders up to the overall company performance. When you get shifted or moved around, let's say you get moved, either your whole team, so you and your manager go collectively to report to a new senior leader, or you get moved. It's really, to me, the advice I would give if that happens to you and you're trying to wonder, like, am I being tossed around and, why is this happening? You put that one-on-one with the calendar, if you put the one-on-one with your new manager, if it's a new manager, if it's not, then you put it on with your existing manager and you essentially say, how are we you ask point blank, how are we contributing to this team? Like, what is our purview? If that's something that you can ask of the new manager, great. If it's something that you've got to relay back through your existing manager because you all moved collectively. And oftentimes what I found is people will, if you're still with your same manager, but you got moved to a new senior leader, there's a deck that's put together that often shows what your team is capable of doing or what they've been working on or what the roles on that team are. It's really important. It's not necessarily asking a question, but that your work and what you are doing is represented there. And that however that is relayed to, new group, new division, whatnot, that it's accurate so that they know where the skill sets are, where the expertise are, where they could lean in. Oftentimes, sometimes you're going to bring a different skill that maybe doesn't exist on that team. But if there's duplicative roles, I would empower people to say, there are, 4 PMs on this team. Can you help me understand where I fit into this new structure? Am I going to be potentially offloading some of the work of these 4 PMs because they can't support all of the aspects of the business? Is there a new, let's say, pillar that's coming that we will be supporting and I will be dedicated to that, or I will be working? And again, I'm just talking specifically as a PM, just trying to think off the cuff here of what I would ask. Depending on what those answers are, might give you more of a sense of, oh, they have a place for me, or I feel like I'm going to be moving or transitioning into this. When that is not answered, and maybe it stays more vague, that's when, for me, my spidey sense would be, I don't know that they know what to do with this yet. And again, that's only because I've been through it as much as I have. But getting specific on either taking a look at the new team, reading the roles of the new team or consolidated teams or changed teams, if that happens to be what's happening, trying to figure out how your work or the work that you have been doing could factor into this team. And if that is not clear, to either relay that up to your immediate manager. Let's say, again, you went collectively as a team, so you still keep your same manager, to relay that to the senior leader. If not, and you're getting a new manager, then that is a direct conversation that you have with them. But some of that onus is on you as the employee, or would be on me as the employee, to take a look at that team, to take a look at the consolidated team, to see what is their purview. What are they going after? I keep using that word a lot, but that's true because each team is going to have some goals, some strategic thing they have to go after. And you're trying to find or connect the dots of how you fit into that. And sometimes that might be very clear and they might be very upfront and saying, yes, it's great because we're needing to actually offload XYZ. We envision you doing this, but sometimes not. And that's what happened to me this past year. I could not get clarity about what I was going to be doing. I got a lot of, we're still figuring that out. We're still figuring that out. And that isn't necessarily a great feeling because you don't then think that, at least for me, you do, there is this part of you, and I think maybe it's just human nature to try to be optimistic and think, okay, they'll find a spot for me. But then there's the other side of going, this doesn't feel right, because if they knew, I think they would have told me by now.
No, that's the journey, and I love this little bit of a career coaching pivot that we've taken here, but I like it. How, as you're having these conversations, did you have a moment where you're like, okay, I got to go work on AI because everybody's working on AI, and if you're not working on AI, you don't matter, right? You're going to be laid off, right? And I super broad stroke because there's plumbing that needs to be done, there's documentation that needs to be written, designs that need to be designed. But in the grand scheme of things, with every tech company, they're the hot things, cool things, the shiny things, and there's everything else, right? And the closer you are to the shiny thing, it almost feels like the safer you are. But as we're seeing, correct. Not the case. I'm curious, did you ever have a sense of, I need to run towards that because it's quote unquote, so our podcast listeners, the quote unquote, it's safe?
Yeah.
Or did you just have a sense of, hey, you know what? I really like what I'm doing right now. I'm going to dig deep into this skill set. And chips fall where they may. I love what I do. Curious how you processed what you worked on at that tech company to keep yourself there, or you're like, you know what, I just love, I need to go work on this shiny thing because that's where all the money is, that's where all
Yeah.
the organs go, etc. You know where I'm going with that?
Yes, and that's actually a very good point. And there are people that do that.
Mm.
And I would say I actually did that in the year before leading up to the layoff, which is ironic.
Mm.
So for the first like 2.5 years, I was really happy of what I was doing. I was supporting a team and I was implementing, we called it an agile-ish way of working. Because again, marketing business, it's really hard to go super tech, Scrum Agile. And I loved it. Great. I loved being that air traffic control, but a shiny object that came out of that was at the time, the marketing leader wanted to turn the marketing department into working agile across the board. And she wanted to do it within like 6 months. And so people came to me, or I saw that as an opportunity. And I said, I really would love to be on that design team. And I really would love to participate in that because I'm actually an ACP. So as an Agile certified practitioner and trying to work that way, even though I'm on the business side, that's something that's a real passion of mine. So I did run to it. And then that marketing leader left. And so what happened was that team's purview sort of went to nil.
Wow.
So there is a risk sometimes when you do that. And particularly in the sense that some things are long-term. So, right, AI is going to be a long-term thing. This isn't going to be the current shiny object for just this year. But there can be sometimes initiatives that are done at the year level. And depending on if they're successful or not, depends on if you keep doing them. So I tend to be cautious about that. One thing is what is the work? What is the long-term vision of the work? Do I think this is a one-time thing or is it going to be something that's going to go over 3 years? Versus also, I do like what I do and I kind of want to continue to evolve this role. And I think I can actually, year over year, I'm changing or iterating on something that I might be doing that could be better for the next year. I don't know if I hadn't had that experience, I think my answer to you right now would have been different. But having chased it, then watched the leader kind of leave, and then watch our team that I chased to go get on be kind of not having a purview after she left, makes me very cautious now to do that. I'm not saying that's true for everybody, and everybody's experience might be different. And there could be other teams and places that don't seem so knee-jerk or potentially volatile or could change if a leader decides to leave. Like the initiative will be there whether or not the leader stays or goes. That could be a defining or a qualifying question to ask yourself. Do you think that the thing that you should run to, if that leader left, would it go with the leader and then you would be left on a team with no purview? Mm-hmm. If the answer is no, then I would say yes, absolutely. There could be other ways to kind of look for a space in the org that could, if you're getting the spidey senses like I've talked about, could find you a good place to land. But if you can't answer the question of, is this really just a pet project that is suddenly everybody's putting all their energy and focus on, and if that leader leaves, it goes with that leader, I'm not sure that I would run to it. Even if that meant that I still didn't necessarily feel there was a safe place for me, or I'd have to just kind of wait it out. Because either way, in those two scenarios, it ends the same. You either go to a team and that team has no purview, or they make a decision where you are to eliminate you. You still are potentially laid off. So I would encourage folks to think about that a little bit before just kind of trying to run someplace. Because especially within tech, things change very, very quickly. They can change within a half year, within a quarter. So there's a lot of movement and shifting that may seem like it's the cool thing to go do, but you want to think a little bit more like, is this going to be around in 2 years? What's that look like?
And
even a
there's also
year.
the digging deep within. It's like, okay, great. Do I really love this work?
Yeah.
Yes, it's paying the pit, but do I really love this work? As I grow in this career, how do I tap into these things that are the natural? They mean so much more. Or I'm working in an audience, nonprofit. It's so interesting to meet people from all around, like the Susan G. Komen Cancer Society. It's a nonprofit. They have an incredible tech team that's running this thing and building this community, and so the power that tech brings to the story very much is powered by people. And so it's super interesting to see how these dots are being connected. Courtney, there's so many themes here I love, and definitely it's running out of time here. And so just two large themes, and we'll jump into the rapid fire questions. As you've been laid off and you've come back, you've been laid off, you've come back again for unique. You have built this such resilience here. How do you, and the word that comes to mind now is come back, right? You've built these, how do you come back? So you were laid off, you've
Oh,
built these relationships, you've shipped the stuff, you've done all these magic things, and you get laid off. You go through this withdrawal, and then you come back. You have to apply for the next role. You have to, you onboard to this new team, da 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 da, and then you get laid off again. So there is a repeating pattern of being able to be resilient and come back that you have built over time. I'm curious, what are some of the elements of that like folks who, okay, this may become a recurring theme in our industry,
right.
where the amount of time you stay in a role is actually shorter because things are changing so fast. What are some of the tools or techniques in your toolbox we mentioned earlier that you draw from in this time of change?
Yeah. Um, so first thing is you have to let yourself feel the feels. Okay. So what I mean by that is you, you have to just be in a space where you don't let yourself cry. If you want to crawl under the sheets for a week, that's fine and not leave, right? Try to not deny the emotion because suppressing it and not talking about it, it actually is worse. And it helps to get it out and it helps to articulate those feelings to yourself so you can get past that initial not great feeling. And then it's really actually leaning into people and a support network, I feel. And that doesn't necessarily mean everything on LinkedIn, right? So we oftentimes default to going to LinkedIn and that's right, I've done it. Hey, I've been laid off. I post the message, looking for connections. But sometimes it's more about the people in your immediate day-to-day circle that are huge buoys for you and remind you of your value. Your value is not defined by this. Your life is not defined by this. I had multiple people and have had multiple people throughout all of the layoffs check in. How's it going? Not like, hey, did you find a job yet? That is probably the worst question to ask somebody that's either been laid off or is going through trying to find a role in it. Maybe it's taking more time. It's a personal check-in to remind you that like life is still out there and there are people still out there and that getting outside of the immediate day-to-day of wanting to just try to find a job all day, every day on LinkedIn or doing job boards, you have to give yourself the space and the grace again to time box it. So you only spend certain amounts of time through the week or certain days that are devoted to that. The rest are devoted to your wellness, your self-care, whatever that means to you. If that means going and being out, doing walks and being exercising and outdoor, if it means being creative, playing music. I was doing both, right? I was doing my music as a drummer and jazz musician, but I was also doing my own podcast, right? There are other outlets by way of filling the space and the time while you're in between and in transition. And what that does is help remind you of you are more than your job and you are more than this experience. And it rounds out the sort of holistic sense of yourself. Do not do it alone, right? Do not try to face it alone. Or if you're really just having a bad day, there's that friend or two that you're like, I just really need a moment. I just really need a chat. Do you have time? Let's meet for something, right? And reach out in those moments when those are happening. Because if you stay in that sort of sad space or hurt space or maybe uncomfortable space, it can really do a number on you. And also, if you are really trying to do 8 hours a day looking for role, it's just not mentally a good thing to do. And that's why I say time boxing has helped me a lot and helped keep things in perspective by way of leaning into personal network, in addition to professional network, but personal network, those sort of those lifers, as we like to say, in your life, and the things that bring you joy. So those are huge buoys to build back your sense of self that then can lead to resilience. And that's been true in every layoff that I've been through. I don't get there super quick sometimes, but it does happen. So
I love that. This sense of find what brings you joy, and it helps you rediscover your sense of self. One of the things you go through is this confidence crisis, this identity crisis, right? Where it's like, oh my gosh, like, who am I? Can I do this? Is it really true? I'm not capable of doing it. And you realize very, very quickly that I share this with folks. It's like, dude, you need to remember what you've got some game,
that's right.
And one of the things we talk about is, the skills and achievement inventory, where you go back and list, like, look, I shipped this thing, I built this thing, I designed this thing, I led this team. And over time, your confidence starts to come. It's always been there, but it's just been redirected by this to your, experience, this temporary event.
Yeah, it's temporary. That's a very important point.
Yep.
It can sometimes be a long temporary. And we've certainly seen that, at the time that we're recording this is, early 2025. And we saw 2024 being a really hard year, even though unemployment, quote unquote, numbers were down. That doesn't count people that are on long-term unemployment or have really struggled to find roles. And so it can sometimes feel like a really long, dark tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
But the belief and the reminder of you and what you've done, and also just you personally as what matters to you, what are your tenets, your personal values, all of those things can contribute to undoing this sense of the identity that you don't have and is oftentimes tied to a job. I just came back from a trip to Europe, and, the way in which work is viewed not in the US is very different. So people do not define their lives by their job when you're not in the US, but we oftentimes do that here. We kind of define our life by what our work is and our job, and there's actually a whole lot more to that and a whole lot more to us than simply where we work. And sometimes in a layoff moment, you actually rediscover and find that within yourself in a way that you might not have without the layoff. So but it's, I want to be totally mindful. It's not all sunsets and rainbows. You're going to have your good days where you're like, yes. And then you're going to have the days where you just feel like I just can't with the world today. Both are valid. And it's the evolution of how we all kind of find our new and find our next that leans into the fact that we are more than where we work. And there are people and things in our lives that fill that space when the workspace is maybe in transition and we don't know what's next. And sometimes something out of the personal actually becomes the next work. And people have made huge shifts and changes and said it's the best thing that ever happened to me. And it allowed me to pursue passion XYZ and turn that into my work. I love those stories. It hasn't happened for me yet, where it's taken something personal and that's become my job. But there are stories of that. But it's not without the struggle and wanting to be sensitive and knowing that sometimes it's really difficult to find next.
Mhm.
And that is okay. But you fill that space with the things that can help get you through or sail you through the stormy seas to your next harbor, or find the lighthouse that'll take you to your next harbor.
What a beautiful way to put that. Courtney, thank you. Just you've dropped some incredible gems. All right, last question, I guess. So what are you doing right now? What are you doing on your little piece of the planet? We like to say. Yeah, yeah,
My little piece of the planet. So I'm still doing my. I'm actually trying to put together an all-female jazz band at the
Oh, very
moment.
cool.
I'm really inspired to try to elevate female musicianship, so I'm trying to do that. Still doing my own podcast, so that's more of a life journal podcast, kind of telling stories of. I frame it around pillars of wisdom, inspiration, experiences, and adventures. But also, I have taken a new role. So I'm back in the senior PM marketing communication space for a nonprofit. And it's very different for me. So I've not actually worked in a nonprofit before. So I'm learning a lot. I feel like I'm kind of in nonprofit school at the moment. But all in all, I'm in things like this and meeting folks like yourself and trying to if some of the things that I've gone through in my life can be helpful guidance to other folks that might be really struggling for context or how to get through it, I find I have a real passion about that. Whether I meet somebody on this, in a class or at work, and I can share that with them, that really brings me feels like I'm paying it forward to all the people that did that to me and helped me. And so I try to find ways in which to do that, as well as just really lean into being those pieces of joy that balance out whatever my working corner of this world is at the moment. And I think this last year has really taught me how important that is. It's the first time I've really ever had the time to take to do that. And I think it's given me a whole new perspective. So that's me for now. Who knows? We'll see what
We'll
happens
see
this year.
what the next wave is going to be.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That is incredible. Courtney, thank you so much for the time. I think the experiences that you've had, to your point around paying it forward, is really there. There are folks who are going through it. There are folks who are coming out of it. There are folks who are finding a new role. There are folks who are, is this going to happen to me again? Right.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
all of that, I think, is this conversation is seasoning that. And this is the reason why we're doing what we're doing. So thank you for the time. And so we'll put these show notes together and we'll make sure that all of the things you mentioned, including your podcast, we'll
Oh, yeah.
share a bit more about that
Anyone would like to come
in the
over.
show
Yeah.
notes.
No, thank you, Leo. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you. And hopefully what I've shared here gives people is a light in this journey as they go through wherever they might be in this journey. So happy to have chatted with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for the time today. We really appreciate it. This is what we're all about, really just listening to these stories and ensuring that we find where we can encouragement, inspiration, and that light that Courtney talked about to the next chapter. So all of this will be in the show notes. Again, really looking forward to getting these published on all our platforms. So thank you for the time. And we look forward to catching you guys all on the next episode of the Layoff Legends podcast. Bye, everyone.